How's it going, man?
I am doing great. How about you?
I'm happy that it's like 70 degrees in New York right now, and I got the windows open.
Nice.
I banged out a YouTube video this morning after I got home from the gym, which felt good, but all the windows were closed because it's been so humid here. And at the end, I'm like sweating, like I have sweat on my face, but I just had to get it done. But then I realized like we had such a crazy rainstorm last night, and now it's just all
Yeah.
cool, and it feels wonderful because it's been super humid this summer.
I think the sweat you're sweating was from React,
Yeah,
not from the
I was
humidity.
like, am I
It's
gonna
just
need
that's
a
what
use effect
happens.
here, or like, oh, jeez. But yeah, we want to talk about today unstyled React components, which is what I made my YouTube video about and also published a blog post on this week. So we're working on this course called Advanced React Component Patterns, and we had talked about recursive components. Did we talk about that in the podcast?
I don't know. We might have mentioned it, but you do have a YouTube video on it, so
I
we'll
made a
link
YouTube
that.
video. Yep,
Yep.
we'll link that for sure. But the course is going to go over, 6 or 7 of these different patterns with demos, and recursive components was the first one I made for YouTube. But we have a bunch. We're going to talk about compound components, render props, unstyled or renderless components. Sometimes you hear them, or headless components. Sometimes you hear them called. And today we want to talk about unstyled components. So, what is an unstyled component? Well, these days a lot of people are familiar with them because kind of what we talked about last week, a lot of the UI libraries that folks use these days are unstyled. So, if you install Radix or Headless UI or React Aria and you render a dropdown, you get, the anatomy of a dropdown and it includes all of the behavior, but it doesn't give you a styled dropdown the way you would expect. So that's essentially what an unstyled component is. It's a way to share some behavior and logic and possibly some JSX, some markup as well that's needed, kind of the root JSX needed for the behavior, the interaction to work. But then you're in control of the styling. And
I've I have a question. So why would you want like? Can you just if people have never used these, why would they want that? Like, why would you prefer this type of component over something, say like a something that shipped both styling as well as behavior?
yeah, it's a good question. I think it's always good to understand where these things come from and why they were created, the abstractions, in order to understand what problems they solve. So, little history lesson, if you use Bootstrap or Material UI, what you are buying into when you use a library like Material is a certain design system. You might hear them called design system components. And you're basically agreeing that your app is going to look a certain way. It's going to have certain colors, certain shadows, certain typography, certain spacing, certain font sizes. And this makes it really convenient because you can just install Material, start building. You get panels, you get drop downs, you get buttons and toggles and forms. And if your app looks like one of these kind of pre designed systems, then you're going to have a great time. But as you and I know very well, and I'm sure many of our listeners do too, once you have a requirement that kind of steps outside the lines of these design systems, that has a styling requirement that doesn't fit in something that the library provides, you try to override the styles of the thing. So you need a drop down, but it needs to be in a dialogue, and it just doesn't work quite right because they didn't think about that. They hadn't foreseen that use case. And now you're fighting with overrides, basically. So it's nice because you get the drop down behavior. It's very hard to build a drop down. That's going to work well on all devices. That's going to account for edge cases like really long text items or long menus or scrolling where the drop down is off screen. But you want to adhere to your brand and your UI and your app. And so this is like this tension that existed in a long time with libraries like this and still does in a lot of frameworks and communities. So the way that tools like Radix solved this was to say, well, how can we share all the anatomy, the bones of a dropdown in a way that doesn't bring along any styles? It's completely unopinionated. So the reason you're going to use it is for the behavior, but you're going to get complete control over the styling of it. And that's what an unstyled component is. And it's essentially what it sounds like. You render a dropdown and you render a list of dropdown items, and what you get is basically black text on a white background that kind of looks like it's positioned near it. You use the arrow keys and you can select them, but it looks like it's a completely broken dropdown. In fact, it is a perfectly built dropdown that is just devoid of CSS. That's basically the way to think about it.
Cool. Very cool.
So as these libraries started coming out and these patterns emerged for how to share this behavior with things like hooks or component APIs, this pattern became more popular. And if you think about at a very basic level, you probably have written a button component in React before, and maybe that button kind of in the material version has like variant primary, variant secondary, or like color blue, color red, and it has like variant ghost. And if you were to crack open that button component, it's going to return a button with a bunch of styles, and also the behavior and the children prop is going to be there. So the children prop in React is whatever the caller passes to it. And all of these components are going to have children because when I use button from Material or Bootstrap, I need to be able to customize the label of the button, the text that's in there. What a renderless component, what a renderless button would look like is basically just the children. It's just returning a button tag that has nothing else, and then the children. So that you render it, you still can customize the text, but there's nothing else on that element if you were to crack that headless, that unstyled button open and look at it.
Okay, so if I make a button component that's just a button and then returns children, what's the point? Why am I making a new component for this?
Good question. So this is where, let's take a concrete example, which is what's the subject of my video and blog post, which is why would you do this? Well, let's say that you have a button in a part of your app that has a nice loading UI to it, and it renders a spinner. And if anyone's ever done this before, I'm sure you see this. You'll probably see this today on the internet. You'll go to buy a plane ticket. You'll go to buy a concert ticket. You'll go to tweet something on Twitter or Instagram. And when you hit send and it shows you a spinner, the button kind of jumps closed because it's trying to show you feedback. It says tweet, you click it, and then it just shows a spinner instead. And the button gets smaller because the width of the button is determined by whatever the children is currently. And now you're basically saying if is loading is true, I'm rendering a spinner. Otherwise, render some static text tweet. So there's a trick that you can use where you add a relative position to the button. You wrap the spinner in an absolute position span. And that way, the spinner just fits the contents of the button. And instead of removing the label, you just hide it when it's loading. And that gives you this nice button that hides the text, shows the loading spinner, but there's no layout shift, right? So that's like a behavior. That's like a behavior that you would like to share around your app. And so maybe you want to make a loading button that does this. And so to your question, why would you want to do a button that doesn't have styles? The answer is because you have some behavior that you want to share. So that's what a renderless component lets you do. It lets you share behavior or logic without forcing the consumer to use any abstracted or pre-chosen styles for how that button should look. So instead of just returning a button with children, now you return a button that has position relative. You give it an is loading prop. And then you bring all that markup inside. It's a span with absolute. It renders the spinner if his loading is true, and it hides the label text if his loading is true. But the label text is still children, so the caller still gets to pass it in. And now the caller can literally swap out lowercase button element with capital case loading button, and all their other stuff is going to stay the same. And when is loading, this new is loading prop flips to true, it's going to have that nice no layout shift loading UI that's going to preserve the rest of their design. So this is a great little use case where you want to share the loading UI, and that's all you want to share. And Yeah, an unstyled component is the way to do it.
That was great. That was really great. What? Okay, so you have the behavior in the component. How do you go about customizing the component? Because how do you go about customizing the button? Because yeah, I have an app and it's got different buttons. It's got big buttons. It's got small buttons. It's do you? So how do you go about doing this? And I guess not to like lead you, but in
Mm-hmm.
some apps that we've worked on, we've seen sort of kind of like a design system adopted to enforce consistency. So you would see a button and maybe like color equals yellow or color equals blue. You kind of touched on this earlier. Style equals ghost, whatever. So
Mm-hmm.
how do you think about, you've talked about the behavior, but obviously buttons have to be styled.
Right.
So how do you do that in this example in your loading
Right.
button?
Good question. Um, so let's finish the example of the loading button as a completely unstyled component that just shares that specific loading UI behavior. Um, if I can find any lowercase b button tag in my whole app and replace it with capital loading button, there's one more step we need to do, which is inside of our loading button where we're returning a button and children, we also want to make sure to forward any other props that someone might pass in to the button element that we're rendering. And if you've never seen this before, there's this component props type helper from React. And if you've never seen splat properties, this is like a JSX feature that comes from like the spread operator in JavaScript, where the props that a component gets, you can just say dot dot dot, rest or dot 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 props. That's like a catch-all for anything else that's passed in. And the component props type helper lets you say what they're supposed to be, what they're allowed to be, because it's a catch-all. And then you can just forward those props to the element that you're actually rendering. So that's the final step in making a truly headless component. And that way, it's really cool when you first see it because I get your loading button. I can still pass on mouse over and on click, and we didn't have to define that. So it's really like a transparent, opaque abstraction where we're just passing it through and then threading in our little loading UI behavior in between. So that's why you want to know about unstyled components because it's a great way to share it. But now, let's say you have other components like you're talking about. Let's say you do have like a button from your UI system. And that button is the purpose of that is to share the styles, right? So the point of my example, just for the record, is like it's not that capital B button components are bad or they're never useful. It's that um, they are useful for sharing code for making a button look a certain way. But the loading UI is not what we wanted to do. So we didn't want to share the styles. We just want to share the loading UI. The headless example is good for that. But
The
if you
behavior.
have buttons that do want to share styles and enforce consistency, or you are using something like, let's say, a material or something from your company's design system, um, that's a good question. Now you have a capital B button and you also have your loading button. And so this is where some more advanced patterns come in terms of how to compose these things. And again, it's really good to look at libraries like Radix and React Aria for some prior art here because this is exactly the problem that they run into. If they give you a drop down, but then you have a drop down item from your design system so that all your drop down items actually look the same, how do you make those work together? And there's a couple ways you can do this. First is sometimes these libraries have an as prop where I can render a drop down item from Radix. And by default, it's going to render like a list item or a button. But I can also pass an as prop and I can give it an actual component. So I could say as Acme drop down button, right? Um, in the implementation level, you can take that component and render that instead of a button. So where your loading button was rendering a lowercase b button, you could instead say, oh, if someone passed in a component they want to render instead of a lowercase b button, I can use that, but I can still decorate it with my loading UI logic. So as is one way to do it. Another way to do it that you'll see with Radix is the as child prop. And you might have seen this also if you use the link component from Next 14. And as child is another pattern that the React community has developed. The way this would look is, let's say you had that loading button, but I really want it to render my Acme button, so I can say variant equals blue or variant equals primary. What you would do with this API is wrap your Acme button inside a loading button, and then loading button would have an as child prop that you add, which is your way of saying I'm going to be responsible for what the immediate child that's rendered is. And this is more or less a similar thing to the as prop, where in your implementation, you're going to say, oh, if we're as child, instead of rendering a button element ourselves, we're going to take all of the logic from our loading UI and we are going to forward anything you pass to the immediate child. And then we can also choose where we render that child's children. And so that lets you slot that child's children into your little invisible span tag and let you put your loading UI right before it. So as child is another way to pull this off.
Cool. I think the thing, if you've never used these before, I think the point you're trying to drive home is that even if you have design requirements, you don't have to go in and add design to this loading button that you described. You could always just keep it as behavior, and then there's other ways you can get design. Also, too, I think one way that we would do it is you touched on forwarding attributes, and so class name gets forwarded. So you can use class name, and I think you do that in the blog post. And I think that's just generally how we would approach these things, at least at like the first pass. I don't know if
Exactly.
okay.
Yep, absolutely. Kind of like stepping back here, I think the bigger thing that we want to try to communicate with all of these different patterns is they all exist to help you solve problems of duplication and reuse at different levels. And making a new React component is kind of like the easiest abstraction. It's like the first thing you learn when you are writing React. And so it's the only tool you know to reach for when you run into a problem of wanting to reuse code. And so you see a button that has some loading UI, you have another button, let's make a component. A renderless component is like stepping down the ladder of abstraction, saying, I actually want to just share some behavior, but I don't want to abstract the styling or the actual element yet because that's not what I'm trying to share. All my buttons look different right now. So renderless or a unstyled component is a way to do that. And then things like props, people mention different ways of making like these design system buttons with like variants and how you can build those. There's libraries that help you solve that problem. But there's ways that these different patterns can compose together. And the way we think about things these days is like start by abstracting the thing that is painful, the duplication that's painful. Because if you jump to a high level abstraction too early, that's what gets you in trouble. That's like,
And that in this case, that would be a button that has styling and variants as well as behavior, like loading state and spinners and the thing you described with the positioning.
exactly. Like you're sitting there and you see this button that has this janky layout shift loading UI, and you're like, oh, I have another button in this app that has a nice loading UI because of that absolute trick. I want to reuse this behavior, this code. I want to reuse this code. That's kind of like the moment when the programmer is like, all right, I need to like create an abstraction. And programmers love abstractions. We love reaching for them. But if you don't have all these patterns that you know about and you don't know when they're appropriate, then you're going to say, well, I'm going to make a button component. And all of a sudden you're making a button component that takes in like a color or a variant prop, which is an abstraction that you're making.
But it's
When
not
the whole,
the reason.
it's not the
the
reason.
reason you created the capital B button.
Exactly. So that's kind of like a nice little spidey sense, a nice little thing to have in your back pocket. If you find yourself abstracting code, but it wasn't the reason you reached for an abstraction or a new file or a new component or a new hook in the first place, there's always, I'm confident to say, there's always a better way to do it that doesn't force you to prematurely abstract that other part.
That's really good. Also, too, it's like, wow, that's so easy. Like, if only I could just follow that. But me personally, that's a really hard muscle that you have to like get reps in and you have to train, because as soon as you reach for that capital B button, you start looking at all the ways that buttons are used throughout your app, and you try to accommodate every single one of them because, hey, I'm creating a capital B button and it should be the perfect capital B button.
I'm glad you said that because I think that, I think one of the reasons that React won, basically, the front end space, and one of my favorite reasons to use it, I think a lot of people's favorite reasons to use it, is because it embraced this locality of behavior. So, before React, like in a traditional kind of Rails of 2010 framework, the layers of the framework, all the components of it, were separated by kind of like concern. And the concern was the technology. So you have, controllers, models, and views. But even beyond something specific like an MVC framework like Rails, even in the front end space, you had, HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. And that was kind of the the philosophy at the time was that the best way to make maintainable code bases was that you wanted separation of concern. So if you had CSS mixed in with your JavaScript, mixed in with your HTML, it was really easy to create a mess. And so a lot of people came up with all sorts of approaches for organizing all three parts of these things. And if you needed to make a change to the behavior, you would open the JavaScript. If you need to change the styling, you'd open the CSS. And it sounds kind of good in theory, and it sounds organized, and it appeals to that abstraction part of our programmer brain. But, when Pete Hunt came out and did kind of a lot of talking about the philosophy of React, he made the argument that this was not a separation of concerns. It was actually a separation of technologies. And it was just because we didn't have a good tool or library that unified them that led to this separation in the first place. So in practice, every time you need to change a screen, you ended up opening the HTML, the CSS, and the JavaScript files separately. And that's a sign, again, if you're making a change and all the things that you need to change are strewn across these three files, these three different tools, it's not the best abstraction. It's just a limitation of technology. And React kind of unified all three of those pieces into a single component that lets you change styling, logic, and the markup all in one. And so, again, I think that's a big reason that React won, because you can start an app with a single component and you can make all those changes right there. So that's like that principle of locality of behavior. And I think that makes React super fun to work on. And people realize, even though we had learned for so long, been drilled into our heads that we had needed to separate our concerns and have things separate, it was just the fact that it was easier to work on that made us realize actually there's a tension between separation of concerns and locality of behavior, right? And so fast forward to today, where we have all these different patterns in React, all these different ways to do abstractions. It's still true that we have a tendency to want to abstract everything, make that capital B button component, and say, how is every button used in my entire app? But what's beautiful about these kind of advanced patterns, renderless components and render props and hooks, is that we now have ways to abstract only the thing that is causing the pain point, the duplication, the code reuse that we want that trigger this in the first place, without having to jump to how does every button work in my whole app. Hooks were a great example of this. Hooks let us share something like getting the current user without having to understand how the current user is used everywhere in our app, because it's not tied to the UI anymore. It's just the behavior. It's just the data. Now I can drop a use current user hook anywhere, and I don't have to do that big abstraction. It's like a small level up. It's a small step on this ladder of abstraction, and it helps you avoid prematurely abstracting the wrong thing, which again is what makes code base so hard to work with. So that's why these patterns are so good. And like you said, it is a muscle you have to flex. You have to get experience with it, and you have to see how these patterns are used. But once you get to the point where you understand them, every time you hit something where you're like, oh, I know I have this somewhere else in my app. How can I use it here? You have, these 6 or 8 different tools that you can wield, and you know which one is perfect for the thing you're trying to abstract and nothing else. You don't abstract anything else by accident.
Really good, really good. I wanna rewind a little. Something I never really thought of is how do you know an abstraction is good? So I think there's like two ways to look at it. The first way is um, you create the abstraction and you come up with a bunch of scenarios in your head, and you can basically, and as programmers, this is what we do. We create the abstraction. We come up, oh, can it work with like, can it work with a number? Can it work with a string? Blah blah blah. Whatever kind of thing you're working on, and you run through all those cases, and it works. There's no like curveball thrown in, and then you're like, that's a good abstraction. But that's a very like that's you're starting and you're trying to predict the future, and you're basically coming up with all these cases, testing them, and being happy with your abstraction. And I think most of the times I create abstractions, that's the way I'm thinking. But you highlight another way of thinking, which I think is really good, which is create the abstraction and then you kind of look backwards. In a month from now, when you have to go make a change, do you have to change 5 different files? Do you have to understand a large part of the system to make the change, or are you just in one file making a small change? And I think to your point, if you are making small changes in one file without having to understand all these different parts of the system, that right there is a good abstraction. So it's almost backwards looking, but
Exactly.
it's
Another way to say
really powerful.
it's powerful and it's easy to forget. And it's so easy to forget, regardless of how many years you've been doing this, that it's a good reminder. One of my favorite kind of thought leaders from the Ruby community is Sandy Metz. And she used to talk a lot about this sort of thing in her conference talks. And the way she put it is that duplication is far cheaper than the wrong abstraction. And that's so true. But like you said, it's easy for us to just zoom and try to say, oh, it should just be like this. And you're trying to predict everything. So instead of that top down approach to creating abstractions, what we try to do in our own work and try to teach people that we help and consult with and in our videos and our courses is the best way to create good abstractions is to extract them.
Yeah.
Extract them from code that's already duplicated, that's already reused. Wait for the duplication to cause some specific pain. And that pain could be the button on this page doesn't look like the other 10 buttons on our app. So we need some way to avoid that happening in the future. That could be a pain that's big enough that it calls for an abstraction. It could be that, fetching the current user is taking up all my time and I just am trying to work on this feature. I need an easier way to fetch the current user. I'm getting confused every time I do it.
I'm just
That
trying
is
to
a
I'm just trying to create a button that shows a loading spinner.
Right.
Yeah.
Exactly. Exactly. And you end up having to relearn position relative, position absolute. You're going to reduplicate. So there's pain points that come up while you're doing a thing, building a feature, fixing a bug. And you're like, okay, yeah, I can see this. I can see it. She had this other thing called like the rule of three, where just wait until there's 3 times when something's painful. Maybe the first time you have a 10th button that was, missing the border radius and it looked inconsistent and your design or project leader got mad at you for it. You say, okay, my bad. And you go fix it right there. And you just wait until it's a problem again. Once it happens a third time, maybe that's when you start thinking about extracting an abstraction. Instead of trying to top down write it, you get it from the bottom up. And this is what I love about React so much is that you can hit that pain point. You can pull up the 3 examples and you can squint and you can say, okay, what am I trying to share here? Is it behavior? Is it styling? Is it data? Is it that, these are in an inconsistent state and what's really going on here is like I have multiple sources of truth. There are answers to every single pain point, every friction point that you run into. And there are tools like, again, hooks, compound components, unstyled components, all sorts of things that let you get at the thing that is causing the pain without over abstracting, without prematurely top downing it and setting yourself up and your coworkers up for having to understand a lot more of the system in the future when they need to make a change.
Right.
But ultimately, I think at the end of the day, like, these conversations can get really abstract. DHH always said, show me the code. And I think it's a nice way to say, like, at the end of the day, I had to add a new screen and, oh, someone's telling you how good their button component is. But like, look at the PR. I had to add a button. I had to go into your implementation. I had to understand all the effects that were there and I had to make a change. that's not fun to work on. That's not a good abstraction. And so sometimes you need to unwind those. But I think the best way to avoid those in the first place is to understand all the tools that we have at our disposal as React developers and make sure you use the minimum one. And you're only abstracting the thing that is the pain point and nothing more.
It's funny. You have to understand, like you said, you have to understand the high abstraction, the capital B button that does everything, the top of the ladder, and then understand all the ways that abstraction can be broken down into smaller abstractions and then composed back into creating that capital B. But it is hard. Also, just one other thing I want to acknowledge. A lot of times in the real world as programmers, we kind of there's like certain points in the year where you kind of have buy-in to work on a design system. Maybe you have a week or 3 weeks, you just shipped a feature, we're going to go do some code refactoring. And everyone just says, okay, let's, there's not a lot of pressure right now. Let's try to get the whole design system up and running. And I think that this is where like that muscle comes in, where it's just saying like, no, we're not going to rush. Like just because we have buy-in to do this design system, we're not going to rush in and try to predict every future case. So yeah,
Yep.
just want to acknowledge that.
Yep.
But yeah.
Yep, absolutely. And then there's cases where you do have that time and you can look and say what really slowed us down the last time we were on a sprint or on a feature. And it shouldn't require, 3 files and all this code just because we have a new URL that needs to know if the current user is signed in or not. And that really slowed us down because I had to go back into a part of the system I didn't remember. I had to relearn all these things. And so those are like pain points you can jot down. And then again, if you have the right tools at your disposal, you can properly abstract them without going overboard. And what we're really talking about here is just software design in the large, where if you have a bunch of use effects and you want to share them, you extract it into a custom hook. You still have to decide what arguments to pass into it. And that is a matter of taste and experience and getting your reps in and flexing that muscle too. Because if you pass the wrong arguments or it knows too much or it knows too little, it's tied to a specific use case, it's not generic enough, that can cause problems too. So this idea of like creating good abstractions extends beyond just React and the patterns that we've been talking about, but the patterns that we're highlighting in the course are really useful for the kinds of problems that React developers run into, which is why we're focusing on them. But I think, from our perspective, our philosophy is all the same here, which is the best abstractions are extracted from real use cases and they're not over designed. And if you find yourself trying to predict the future too much, it's a good chance you're going to end up with something that you're going to hate in a month or 6 months from now.
Yep. Been there before.
I was there yesterday. Cool. All right.
So folks that are interested in this course, we have a course page. We'll link in the show notes, but you can sign up. We're going to be emailing out updates, previews, just a whole bunch of stuff. So we will link that in the show notes and sign up for that newsletter.
Yeah, absolutely. And the course page is it has a little information about the course and a place where you can sign up. But we're going to be adding, all of our podcast episodes and YouTube videos that are relevant for it. So if you want a taste of the kind of content that's going to be in the course, you'll be able to see it there. But I think that wraps it up for Unstyled Components. We've got some other ones we're excited to talk about, so we'll have to see next week what we've been working on. I have a good example of controlled and uncontrolled components with a sortable list and framer motion. So maybe that'll be what we talk about next week.
Nice. I like it.
Awesome. All right, everyone. Thanks for watching, listening. And if you have any questions, hit us up at FrontEndFirstFM on Twitter or send an email to sam@buildui.com or ryan@buildui.com. And we'll catch you next week.
See ya.
Bye.